The nurse dropped the tray. Not because she was clumsy, not because she was nervous. She dropped it because she needed both hands free. The two men who walked through the front doors of Harlow Creek Medical Center at 7:14 in the morning were wearing visitor badges. They were carrying flowers. They were smiling at the front desk receptionist like ordinary people. But Nora Voss had spent 11 years reading bodies, not faces. And every single thing about these two men, the way their eyes swept the room in a 3-second grid pattern, the way their shoulders never fully relaxed, the way the taller one's left hand stayed unnaturally close to his jacket, told her exactly what was about to happen. She had 6 seconds to decide how many people in this building were going to live. Before we go any further, if you're watching this for the first time, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications. Every week we bring you stories like this one, stories about people the world wrote off who turned out to be the most dangerous person in the room. Drop a like on this video and leave a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to that morning, because nothing about what happened next was what anyone expected. The shift started at 6:45, same as always. Nora Voss arrived 12 minutes early, which was also the same as always, parked her 2009 Civic in the far corner of the staff lot where the overhead light had been broken for 3 months, and walked through the side entrance with her badge already in her hand. The woman at the security desk, a heavy-set man named Gerald, who usually spent the early hours watching sports highlights on his phone, glanced up, gave her a nod that barely qualified as acknowledgement, and buzzed her through without a word. She was used to that. In the 18 months since she'd started working at Harlow Creek Medical Center in Denton, Washington, Nora had become part of the scenery. Reliable, forgettable. The nurse who showed up early, stayed late, never complained about bad assignments, and somehow always had the medication cart restocked before anyone asked. She wasn't popular. She wasn't disliked. She simply existed in the background of a place that ran on ego and hierarchy, and she had learned, very deliberately, to be the kind of person nobody looked at twice. That was the point. She changed into her scrubs in the locker room, taking exactly the amount of time she always took. 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Scrubs, badge, hair back. She kept a small hand mirror in her locker not out of vanity, but because she'd developed the habit of checking the space behind her before stepping back into a hallway. Old training. The kind of reflex that didn't disappear just because the context changed. The morning briefing was at 7, held in the cramped nurses' station on the second floor, where the overhead fluorescent light on the left side had been flickering for 6 weeks, and nobody had fixed it. Nora stood near the back. She always stood near the back, where she had a clear view of the door and the full arc of the room. The charge nurse, a compact woman named Sandra Briggs, who'd worked at Harlow Creek for 22 years and had the emotional temperature of a fire marshal, ran through the board quickly. 14 patients on the floor, 3 pending discharge, 1 incoming transfer from Mercy General in Seattle, a 34-year-old male listed under the protected admission protocol, which meant his name on the board was just an ID number, and his room was at the end of the hall with a security notation attached. Nora noted that without reacting to it. She was assigned to a standard rotation, rooms 207 through 214, plus overflow backup on 215. Nothing unusual. Dr. Raymond Holt would be her attending physician for the morning block, which meant her shift would include at least 2 interactions with a man who had made it quietly but consistently clear that he found her professional judgment about as useful as background noise. She had worked under worse. At 7:12, she was at the medication cart outside room 209, reviewing the chart of a 61-year-old woman named Patricia Dunn, who had been admitted 2 days earlier with a bowel obstruction and was currently recovering from surgery. The chart was straightforward. The dosage was straightforward. Nora double-checked it anyway, cross-referencing the morning notes against the previous night's entry. That was when the front entrance doors opened 1 floor below. She didn't see it happen. She heard it. Not the sound of the doors themselves, but the particular rhythm of footsteps crossing the lobby tile. 2 sets. Even spacing. Not rushed. Not casual either. Something in between that didn't fit any of the normal patterns she'd cataloged over 18 months of paying attention to this building. She kept her eyes on the chart, but her body had already shifted. Her weight moved forward slightly onto the balls of her feet, her breathing slowed by half a count per cycle. These weren't conscious decisions. They were the same automatic calibrations that used to kick in when a convoy rolled into a sector that looked normal but smelled wrong. She finished with Mrs. Dunn's medication, replaced the chart, and moved to the stairwell door at the end of the hall, as if she were heading to the supply closet on the first floor. Which she did, in fact, do, but not before pausing on the landing long enough to look down through the reinforced glass panel in the stairwell door at the lobby below. 2 men. Visitor badges. One of them was carrying a cellophane-wrapped bouquet of yellow flowers that still had the grocery store price sticker on the plastic. The taller one was speaking to the receptionist, a young woman named Becca, who always had earbuds in under the desk and was probably listening to a podcast. The shorter man was standing slightly behind and to the right of his partner, left hand close to the jacket, eyes moving in a grid. Nora had seen that exact body posture in 4 countries on 2 continents. It wasn't how civilians stood when they were waiting for a receptionist to look up their patient's room number. She did not run back upstairs. She did not pull out her phone and call the front desk. She walked to the supply closet, opened it, counted the IV kits on the second shelf from the top, a habit she'd developed because knowing the inventory of any space she might need to improvise in was just responsible planning, and then walked back upstairs the same way she'd come down. The medication cart was where she'd left it. She moved to room 211. Her mind was running 2 tracks simultaneously, which was also not new. Track 1. 211 was a 57-year-old man named Walter Osei, post-cardiac procedure, day 3 recovery, mild hypertension, nothing complicated. She needed to check his blood pressure reading from the overnight monitor and confirm the morning med pass had been completed. Track 2. The protected admission at the end of the hall. Room 218. An ID number on the board and a security notation, which in practice meant a single uniformed officer stationed outside the door. She had seen the officer earlier when she arrived, a young guy, maybe 26, who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. His name badge said Pellerin. He was sitting in the chair outside 218 with his arms crossed, and he'd had a paper coffee cup in one hand. 1 officer, 1 door, 1 patient that someone had just sent 2 men with military body posture to find. She checked Walter Osei's blood pressure. It was fine. She made a note. She moved on. At 7:19, Dr. Raymond Holt arrived on the floor in the way he always arrived, with enough noise to announce himself from 30 feet away. He had a loud voice and an unconscious need to use it in proportion to whoever was nearby. With residents, he was expansive. With nurses, he was clipped. With Nora specifically, he'd landed somewhere between dismissive and faintly contemptuous, which she suspected had more to do with the fact that she'd quietly corrected a medication contraindication in front of 2 medical students 6 weeks ago than with anything about her actual competence. Hayes. He stopped using her last name directly around month 2. He'd switched to a habit of addressing her by the wrong last name, Hayes instead of Voss, which she'd corrected once and then stopped correcting because the energy wasn't worth it. Is the Dunn chart updated? Updated at 7:15. Morning meds completed. She's asking about the liquid diet timeline. I'll look at it after rounds. He was already moving past her. And Nora, can you work on moving a little faster through the cart? Sandra tells me you spend twice as long on each station as the other nurses. She looked at him steadily. I double-checked the dosages. It's a med cart, not a bomb disposal unit. He walked away. Behind him, a second-year resident named Tomas kept his eyes carefully on his tablet to avoid being dragged into whatever expression might be on his face. Nora returned to the cart. At 7:24, she heard the elevator open at the end of the hall. She did not look immediately. She kept her eyes on the chart she was holding and counted 3 seconds, which was long enough for most people to reveal their destination without feeling watched. Then she looked. The 2 men from the lobby were walking toward the far end of the corridor. The taller one still had the flowers. The shorter one had his right hand free. They were moving with that same even, controlled pace, and they were angled, not toward the nurse's station or the bathroom or any of the intermediate rooms. They were aimed directly at the far end of the hall, at 218. Officer Pellerin was still in his chair. He looked up from his phone. Visiting hours don't start until... The taller man showed him something, a badge, or something that looked like one. Pellerin relaxed slightly, starting to stand, and Nora's mind made the calculation in under a second. Real federal officers doing a legitimate check on a protected witness did not travel in pairs with grocery store flowers as cover. They did not arrive at 7:24 in the morning without prior coordination with the hospital security office, which she knew had not been contacted because Gerald at the front desk had a habit of calling up to the floor whenever he buzzed through official visitors. Gerald had not called. She set down the chart. She needed to reach the supply room first, the one she'd already inventoried. The hallway was 62 feet long. She covered it in a way that looked like purposeful errand running. Slightly brisk, not running, not hesitating. A nurse who needed something from the far end of the hall. She passed room 214, room 215, room 216. At 217, she heard Pellerin say, "Sir, I still need to verify." Then a sound that wasn't a gunshot, but was adjacent to one, muffled, mechanical, wrong. Pellerin went down. Not dead. Tased from the way he dropped. Not collapsed, but seized up, hitting the chair arm on the way to the floor and making the kind of noise that doesn't carry well through a hospital hallway unless you're already listening for it. Nora was through the supply room door before the sound finished echoing. The supply room at the end of the second floor hall was small. 8 by 12, shelving on 3 walls, one light fixture, door that locked from the inside. She locked it. She was already moving to the shelves, pulling inventory with the focused speed of someone who'd walked through this scenario in her head twice in the last 4 minutes. IV pole. Aluminum, standard gauge. Weight and reach, usable. Saline bags, 500 ml, 6 on the shelf. Blunt force, controlled delivery. Surgical tape, gauze rolls, a blood pressure cuff. The cuff's tubing was roughly 30 inches. Not ideal, but workable. She wasn't building weapons. She was building options. Her phone was in her scrubs pocket. She pulled it out and sent a single text to Sandra Briggs. Code Gray, second floor, end hall. Not a drill. Get everyone back and call it in. She did not call 911 herself. That would eat time and create noise. Sandra had the protocol. Sandra would move. Then she thought about the patient in 218. She didn't know his name. She didn't know what he was a witness to or who wanted him dead, or what the men outside that door had been told to do once they dealt with Pellerin. But she knew that a single room with a locked door and no secondary exit was about to become a very small problem for 2 people who were clearly not amateurs. She had 60 seconds, maybe 90. She picked up the IV pole and the 2 heaviest saline bags, and she opened the supply room door. The hallway was quiet, in the particular way that hospitals get quiet when something has gone wrong and the building itself hasn't caught up yet. No alarms, no shouting. Pellerin was on the floor outside 218, conscious, trying to sit up, and the door to 218 was open. The taller man was inside. The shorter one was standing in the doorway with his back to Nora. She had taken 3 steps toward him before she fully decided to. The saline bag caught him across the side of the head with a sound that was flat and heavy, and he went sideways into the doorframe hard enough to crack the wood trim. She didn't stop moving, stepped inside his fall, dropped the pole grip down, used the butt end in a short arc that redirected his momentum and put him on the floor with his arm at an angle that would keep him there for a while without killing him. The whole thing took 4 seconds. Inside 218, the taller man spun around. He had a weapon out. Not the taser, something else. I was fast. He was good. She could see it in how quickly he recalibrated, taking in the unconscious partner, the nurse with the IV pole, the fact that none of this matched whatever scenario he'd been briefed on. He pointed the weapon at her. Don't. She didn't move. She was standing between him and the door, which was between him and the exit, and the patient on the bed, a thin man in his mid-30s with a bandaged forearm and the specific expression of someone who had spent a long time being afraid, was 6 feet to her left and completely exposed. Step aside, the man said. He was controlling his voice very well. That meant he was trained. It also meant he was calculating, not panicking, which was both dangerous and useful. Dangerous because he wouldn't make stupid mistakes, useful because he would respond to logic. You tased a police officer in a hospital, Nora said, keeping her voice flat. Every camera in this building recorded your face from 6 different angles. Your partner is on the floor, whatever the job was supposed to be. It's already over. Step aside. The floor is on lockdown. She didn't know if that was true yet. Sandra moved fast. You have 1 exit, and it goes through me. He adjusted his grip. She tracked the adjustment, slight rotation, which told her his dominant hand was right and his training was military or close to it. "You're a nurse," he said. The way he said it meant, "You are not a threat." She looked at him for 1 second. "I used to be something else." He moved first. She had known he would. People who are trained to the level this man was trained don't negotiate for long. They assess, they decide, and they commit. He came in fast and low, which was the right call against most targets, but she had already shifted her weight, and the IV pole was already moving, and the thing he had not accounted for was that the woman in scrubs had spent 11 years learning exactly how to neutralize someone who moved fast and low in a confined space. The collision was short and brutal, and not clean. She took a hit to the left shoulder that would leave a bruise the size of her palm. But the weapon went to the floor and he followed it 2 seconds later, face down, arm locked behind his back at an angle that communicated clearly and without words that any attempt to get up would result in something tearing. She was breathing hard. She pressed her knee into the center of his back, reached over without releasing his arm, and slid his weapon across the floor toward the far wall. The patient on the bed, the man in room 218, was staring at her. "Are you injured?" she asked. He shook his head. His mouth was open. "Stay on the bed. Don't touch anything on the floor." She could hear it now, the sound of the building catching up. An alarm somewhere below. A PA announcement she couldn't make out yet. Footsteps on the stairwell. The man pinned under her knee tried to shift, and she increased the pressure on his arm by about 12%, which stopped the shifting immediately. Outside in the hallway, Officer Pellerin had gotten himself upright against the wall and was reaching for his radio with shaking hands, and Nora could hear Sandra's voice somewhere further down the corridor, firm and commanding, doing exactly what needed to be done. Downstairs, through the floor, she could hear the front entrance doors, more people coming in. She kept her position and her breathing and did not let herself think about how bad her shoulder was going to feel in about an hour. Because that was later, and this was now. And what was now was this: 2 men on the floor, 1 protected witness still breathing, and a building that was just beginning to understand that the nurse everyone ignored had been, for approximately the last 4 minutes, the only reason any of this hadn't gone catastrophically wrong. She didn't let go. She waited. And when the stairwell door at the end of the hall burst open and the first set of real tactical boots hit the linoleum, not hospital security, not local patrol, something heavier, something that moved with a different kind of purpose, Nora Voss kept her knee exactly where it was and her eyes exactly where they needed to be. Because whoever was coming through that door, she was going to need to read them in the first 3 seconds. Old habits. The door swung open. The first thing she clocked was the patches. Not the weapons, not the formation, not the number of bodies pouring through that stairwell door. The patches first, because patches told you what kind of authority had just walked into the room, and what kind of authority determined everything about what happened in the next 60 seconds. Left shoulder. Federal insignia, but not FBI standard. The lettering was different. The color blocking was different. These were not local SWAT pulled in on short notice. These were people who had been rolling before the call even went out, which meant someone had known this building was a target before Nora had sent Sandra that text. That information landed, and she filed it without reacting to it. The lead figure, a woman, mid-40s, short dark hair shoved under a tactical helmet she hadn't bothered to strap, swept the room in exactly the kind of 3-second grid pattern Nora had clocked on the 2 men in the lobby an hour ago. Except this time the pattern stopped on Nora, specifically on the position of Nora's knee, Nora's grip, and the man pinned underneath her on the linoleum. The woman held up one fist and the team behind her stopped moving. "Federal Protective Detail," she said. Not loud. The voice of someone who'd learned that volume was mostly wasted energy. "We're going to need you to step back from the subject." "He's secure," Nora said. "Left shoulder's compromised. He won't be going anywhere fast." A beat. "Ma'am, I need you to step back." "I heard you." Nora looked at the man under her knee, then at the woman in the doorway. "His partner is in the hall, also secure. Neither of them has been searched." Another beat. Slightly longer this time. The woman in the doorway made a small gesture to her left, and 2 of the team members peeled off toward the hallway. Then she looked back at Nora with an expression that wasn't quite assessment and wasn't quite something else. Somewhere in the space between those 2 things, unreadable in the specific way of people who had trained themselves not to give information away in their faces. "Step back," she said again. "Please." Nora released the arm. She stood. She moved to the left side of the room and put her back against the wall next to the patient's bed, because old habits, and she kept her hands visible at her sides, because old habits again. The team moved in fast and professional and had the man from the floor zip-tied and vertical within about 20 seconds. I was in pain and not bothering to hide it anymore, which told her the shock of the situation had worn off, and what was left was just injury and consequence. The woman, who still hadn't given a name, crossed the room and looked at Nora directly. "You did this?" "He moved first." "That's not what I asked." Nora looked at her. "Yes." The woman's eyes dropped to the IV pole leaning against the wall, then to the saline bag on the floor, then back to Nora's face. Something shifted in her expression by about 2 degrees. "Are you injured?" "Left shoulder. I'll manage." "We're going to need a statement." She pulled out a small notebook, actual paper, which Nora noted, and a pen. "Name?" "Nora Voss, second floor nursing staff." The woman wrote it down. "How long have you worked here?" 18 months? Any prior law enforcement or military background?" There was a half-second pause before Nora answered, not long enough for most people to catch. "I did some contract medical work overseas a few years back." The woman looked up from the notebook. "Contract medical work," she repeated. "That's right." She wrote something down. Whether she believed it or was simply cataloging the gap in it, Nora couldn't tell. The woman had a good face for this. Nora respected that. "Don't go far," the woman said, and moved back toward her team. The patient in the bed, the man from 218, had not said a single word through any of this. He was watching Nora with the kind of attention people give to things they're trying to decide whether to be afraid of or grateful for. I was thin, mid-30s, dark circles under his eyes that came from weeks of bad sleep rather than last night specifically, and the bandaged forearm was recent. The wrap was clean but not hospital-issued, which meant it had been done somewhere else before transfer. Nora looked at him. "You're okay?" "Yeah." His voice was rough. He stopped. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. They're going to move you." He looked at the doorway, at the tactical team, at the 2 men being walked out in zip ties. "They were going to kill me." "I know." "You're a nurse." "I know that too." He opened his mouth and then closed it again, because there wasn't a follow-up question that would have made sense, and somewhere in the silence between them he seemed to understand that. He leaned back against the pillow, and his hands, which had been gripping the bed rail, slowly released. Nora pushed off the wall and walked into the hallway. The second floor of Harlow Creek Medical Center had achieved the particular species of controlled chaos that hospitals develop when something has gone badly wrong and staff are trying to keep both patients and the situation contained. Sandra Briggs was at the nurse's station with her arms crossed and her face doing the thing it did when Sandra was furious but professionally obligated not to show it, a slight tightening around the jaw, a very deliberate stillness in the rest of the expression. She was speaking in a low, clipped voice to 2 hospital security officers who looked like they wished they were somewhere else. Officer Pellerin was sitting against the wall 10 feet from the door of 218 with a silver emergency blanket around his shoulders that someone had draped there out of protocol rather than temperature. He was holding his radio. His hands were steadier now than they'd been 20 minutes ago, which was good. Nora crouched next to him. "How are you doing?" He looked at her. He was young up close, younger than she'd clocked earlier. 24, maybe. "I got tased." "I know. Did you hit your head when you fell?" He thought about it. "Door frame. Side of it." "Let me see." She didn't wait for permission. She turned his head slightly, checked the spot above his ear with 2 fingers. No laceration, slight swelling, didn't feel like anything structural. "You're going to have a headache. Someone needs to check you for concussion protocol before you go anywhere." "I'm fine." That's what everyone says right before they're not fine. She stood. "Stay sitting until someone with a badge examines you. I mean it." He looked up at her with an expression she'd seen on younger soldiers. Not quite gratitude, not quite embarrassment. The look of someone recalibrating what they thought they knew about a situation and doing it in real time. Down the hall, Dr. Raymond Holt had arrived. She heard him before she saw him. That particular carrying quality his voice had in corridor acoustics, the way it tended to fill space even when it wasn't trying to. He was talking to the woman from the tactical team, and he was using the tone he used when he wanted to establish institutional authority quickly, which was a tone that worked very well on medical students and people who hadn't encountered it before. The woman from the tactical team was not responding to it in any of the ways it was designed to produce. "I need to understand exactly what my staff were exposed to," Holt was saying. "These are my people, my clinical team, and I have a responsibility. Doctor, we'll conduct interviews with all relevant staff as part of the incident response. Right now, I need this corridor clear. I'm the attending physician for this floor, and I appreciate that. Corridor, please." Holt turned. He saw Nora standing near Pellerin. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name. Not the usual dismissiveness, not exactly. Something more complicated than that. He walked toward her. "Voss." She waited. "What happened?" Not demanding, not clipped. Something that was almost in the way of a man who didn't do it often, an actual question. Two men came up from the lobby. They tased Pellerin and went into 218. She kept it simple, factual. "I intervened." Holt looked at the door of 218. He looked at the marks on the door frame where the man had hit it on the way down. He looked back at her. "You intervened," he said slowly. "Yes." "By yourself." There wasn't time to wait. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you hurt?" "Left shoulder, nothing serious." Another pause. Longer. He looked like a man doing arithmetic in his head and not liking the answer. "You should have called it in." "I texted Sandra. She called it in." "You should have—" He stopped, started again. "You should have waited for security." She looked at him steadily. Pellerin was down. Security was 2 floors away. The patient had 30 seconds, maybe less. She kept her voice even. This was not the moment for anything else. Waiting wasn't an option. Holt didn't answer. He looked at his shoes for a moment, which was something she had never seen him do, and then he walked away toward the nurse's station without saying anything else. Behind her, from inside 218, she could hear the tactical team running the patient through what sounded like a relocation protocol. Efficient, low-voiced, methodical. Sandra Briggs appeared at Nora's elbow. "Hospital administrator is on his way up," Sandra said, in a tone that communicated exactly how she felt about that. "How many patients were affected by the lockdown?" 3 rooms were evacuated to the East Wing as a precaution. "Mrs. Dunn is upset. Mr. Osei slept through it somehow, which honestly I think speaks to how good his pain management is." Sandra paused. "The 2 men you put on the floor, they're saying federal transport is taking them out through the loading dock." "Good." "Nora." Sandra's voice dropped slightly. Not softer, exactly. Different. "The team lead, that woman, she's been asking questions about you." Nora looked at the nurse's station. "What kind of questions?" "Background questions. How long you've worked here, what you did before, whether you'd ever mentioned anything about—" Sandra stopped. She seemed to already know something. The shoulder was starting to register in earnest now. A dull, specific ache that she knew from experience would sharpen by evening and be genuinely unpleasant by morning. She rotated it slightly. 40% range. Not great. "She's doing her job," Nora said. "She asked me if you'd ever talked about your past." "What did you tell her?" Sandra looked at her. They'd worked together for 18 months, and Sandra Briggs was not a woman who missed things. She'd been too good at her job for too long to miss the small inconsistencies that accumulated around Nora like sediment. The slightly too correct reactions under pressure. The inventory habit. The way Nora positioned herself in rooms. "I told her you were a good nurse," Sandra said carefully. "Private. Reliable. Thank you. I also told her if she wanted to know anything else, she should ask you directly." Nora nodded. "That's fair." The stairwell door opened again, and this time what came through it was not the tactical team, but a hospital administrator named Dennis Park, who arrived breathing slightly hard from the stairs and immediately started looking for someone to direct his anxiety at. He found Dr. Holt, which was both predictable and, from Nora's perspective, convenient. She used the moment to slip into the supply room, the original one, not the one at the end of the hall, and sit down on the floor with her back against the shelving unit. She needed 45 seconds. Not to recover, not to process. Just to run the numbers on what had happened and what came next. Because there was a version of the next several hours that ended with her explaining things she had spent 18 months very deliberately not explaining, and she needed to think about that clearly before it started happening to her. The two men were in federal custody. Good. That was the cleanest possible outcome for that piece of it. The patient in 218 was alive. Good. Pellerin was banged up but intact. Good. The woman with the notebook had asked about prior military or law enforcement background. That was the part that sat differently from the rest. Because Nora had been here before, not this specific building, not this specific situation, but the moment where something she'd done had opened a door she'd carefully kept closed. And the thing about doors like that was that once someone had a reason to look, they tended to find what was behind them, especially if the person looking was good at her job and had federal resources and had already suspected something before the conversation started. She flexed the fingers of her left hand. The shoulder ached in earnest. She had left the Navy 4 years ago, not in disgrace, in the particular kind of mutual and quiet agreement that happens when someone has done things that are operationally necessary and personally costly enough that both parties decide it's better to part cleanly. Her file was classified in the specific way that meant it existed, but the version that would come back on a standard background check was a heavily redacted summary that said Navy service, medical training, honorable discharge, and nothing else. A federal protective detail with the right clearance level could pull more than that. The question was whether the woman with the notebook had that clearance and whether she had a reason to use it. The door opened. Nora looked up. It was Tomas, the second-year resident who'd been trailing Holt during morning rounds. He was young, mid-20s, with the slightly haggard look of someone perpetually behind on sleep. He was holding a cold pack, which he held out toward her with a slightly uncertain expression. "Sandra said you were in here," he said, "and that your shoulder—" He stopped. "I can leave if you—" "Thank you." She took the cold pack. He had the good sense not to offer to apply it for her. He started to leave and then didn't. He turned back around with the look of someone who'd been rehearsing something. "Those two guys," he said. "In the hall. You—" He stopped again. "I was at the nurse's station when it started and I saw you go down the hall and then I heard the sound and I looked and you were already—" He ran out of words. "Yeah. That wasn't—" He searched for whatever it was he was trying to say. "That wasn't normal." "No." He stood there for a moment. "Are you going to be okay?" She looked at him. He meant it genuinely, which she could tell because he had no apparent angle on it. He wasn't asking because it affected him, wasn't fishing for information, was just a resident who had witnessed something outside his experience and was checking on the person it had happened to. "I'm going to be fine," she said. "Go check on Pellerin. Concussion protocol, not a suggestion." He nodded and left. She held the cold pack against her shoulder and let herself breathe for a moment. 30 seconds later, her phone buzzed. Not a text. A call. Unknown number, which in her experience meant either a spam caller or someone who had gone to some effort to obscure their origin, and she could rule out spam callers given the morning's events. She answered. Silence for 2 seconds. Then, "Voss?" A man's voice. Not young, not old. Something in the cadence of it that she recognized the way you recognize an accent from your hometown. Not because you can name it immediately, but because it's embedded in you somewhere below the level of conscious recall. She said nothing. "This is Caldwell. Don't hang up." She had not spoken to Marcus Caldwell in 3 years, 2 months, and approximately 11 days. She had not expected to speak to him again in any context that was good news. "I'm listening," she said. "We know about the incident at Harlow Creek." A pause. "We knew about it before it happened." The cold pack was very cold against her shoulder. She focused on that. "How much before?" "Enough. We were monitoring the network that ordered the hit. We knew the target. We knew the time frame. We didn't know the specific facility until 6 hours ago, and by then the protective detail was already in motion." Another pause. "We didn't know you were there." "What's your read on the team that came in?" "Clean. They're ours. Well, adjacent to ours. They report to a different desk. The lead is named Rourke. She's good." Special Agent Rourke. Now she had a name for the woman with the notebook. "She's going to pull my file," Nora said. "She already has. The version she'll get is sanitized, but there's enough in it to prompt follow-up, especially after what she saw on that floor. Caldwell paused again. She'd forgotten how he used pauses, not as hesitation, but as information delivery. A pause meant he was about to say something he'd calculated the weight of. There are people here who want to bring you back in, Nora. She looked at the shelving unit across from her, at the boxes of nitrile gloves and the IV supply labels, and the inventory she'd memorized 40 minutes ago because she couldn't walk into a room without memorizing its inventory. No, she said. I know. I'm not calling to recruit you. I'm calling because the network that sent those men this morning, the hit on the witness in 218, it's bigger than one protected individual. There are 3 other locations currently at risk. One of them is in Denton. She went very still. How many civilians? At potential risk? Somewhere between 40 and 120, depending on how they move. She closed her eyes for half a second. Why are you calling me specifically? Because Rourke is going to want to talk to you in about 20 minutes. And when she does, she's going to ask you to make a choice. I wanted you to have context before she walked through the door. He paused one more time. The man in 218. The witness. His testimony connects to a trafficking operation that's been running through the Pacific Northwest for 4 years. The 2 men you put down this morning were the 3rd attempt on his life. The people behind this are not going to stop. Nora stood up. The cold pack fell to the floor. 20 minutes, she said. Give or take. She ended the call. She stood in the supply room for exactly 15 seconds, which was what she gave herself, and then she walked out into the hallway. The second floor had quieted somewhat. The federal team was still present, but had pulled back to a cluster near the stairwell, doing what looked like an information debrief among themselves. Pellerin had been moved to a chair at the nurses' station, where Tomas was now, in fact, running concussion protocol. Sandra was at her desk, handling the cascading administrative fallout of a floor lockdown with the competence of someone who had handled crises long enough to develop a system for them. Holt was standing near room 213, talking to Dennis Park in a low voice. As Nora walked past, Holt glanced at her. The complicated expression was back. The one she couldn't name. She kept walking. At the nurse's station, she pulled up the morning board and confirmed the status of her patient rotation because the shift was still technically in progress, and Mrs. Dunn still needed her blood pressure checked and Mr. Ose needed his morning meds confirmed regardless of what else was happening on this floor. She was in the middle of updating room 211's chart when Rourke appeared at her left shoulder. Can we talk? I'm charting. I can wait 2 minutes. Nora finished the entry, logged out of the terminal, and turned to face her. Rourke was about 5'7", the kind of fit that came from routine rather than effort, and she had the quality of attention that Nora associated with people who listened more than they spoke. She wasn't carrying her notebook now. That was notable. You want to find somewhere more private? Rourke asked. Here is fine. Rourke looked at her for a moment. Okay. She lowered her voice slightly. I ran a preliminary background on you, the version I can access at my clearance level. Nora waited. It's thin, Rourke said. Unusually thin for someone with your apparent skill set. She kept her tone even, not accusatory, noting a fact. Navy Medical Service, honorable discharge. 4 years in civilian nursing. A pause. No details on deployment history? No specifics on the medical training context. That's what's in the file. I know. Rourke looked at her steadily. I'm not here to pressure you about the file. She paused. The 2 men you secured this morning, we've been tracking the organization they work for 14 months. This is the first time we've had physical custody of 2 of their operational personnel. She stopped. We wouldn't have them if not for you. Nora said nothing. The thing is, Rourke continued, they're going to lawyer up within the hour. And once they do, what we can get from them operationally becomes much more limited. We have a window right now. A short one. She looked at Nora directly. The man in 218. His name is Declan Ferris. His testimony covers 4 years of trafficking operations across 3 states. 3 attempts have been made on his life. The network behind those attempts is active, organized, and currently has 2 other targets in this region. There it was. Different voice, same information. What does this have to do with me? Nora said. Rourke looked at her for a long moment. The team I have is good, but we're operating in a city we don't know, in a facility we don't know, against a network that has consistently moved faster than our intel. She paused. You neutralized 2 trained operatives with an IV pole and a saline bag in under 5 minutes, in an unfamiliar confined space, and you did it without injuring the protected witness or yourself significantly. I injured myself a little. You know what I mean. Nora looked at the board, at the names and room numbers and the normal apparatus of a morning shift that was still technically happening around all of this. You're going to ask me something, she said. I am, Rourke said. But before she could say what it was, the radio on her vest crackled, and the voice that came through it said 3 words that changed the shape of everything that had been building since 7:14 that morning. We've got another one. Rourke's hand was already on the radio before the transmission finished. Location, she said. East Side Clinic, Harlow Creek Satellite on Mercer. One of ours just called it in. Single gunman, possibly 2, ground floor. Civilian staff present. No confirmation on the secondary target yet. Nora knew the satellite clinic. She'd covered 2 shifts there in her first month, before they decided she was more useful at the main facility. Single-story building, 12 exam rooms. Waiting area that held maybe 30 people on a busy morning. 1 security guard, retired county sheriff, 60-something, worked the morning shift because the pay supplemented his pension. His name was Doug. She'd had coffee with him twice. Rourke clicked off the radio and looked at her team. Vasquez, Okafor, you're with me. Brennan, hold position here. Maintain witness security. She was already moving toward the stairwell. Nobody leaves this floor. She was 3 steps away when she stopped, turned back. Voss? Nora was already taking off her lanyard. I heard it, she said. She didn't wait for an invitation. Rourke looked at her for exactly 1 second. The same kind of calculation Nora recognized from her own decision-making, the rapid weighing of asset against liability. And then turned and kept moving. Nora followed. She had no weapon, no vest, no badge. She had her scrubs, her ID, a cold pack she'd left on the supply room floor, and whatever was left in her shoulder after the morning. She filed all of that as she moved down the stairs behind Rourke and the 2 agents, not cataloging complaints but cataloging facts. Facts were workable. Complaints were not. The vehicle outside was an unmarked black SUV with federal plates that had been idling in the ambulance lane since the team arrived. Rourke was in the passenger seat. Vasquez drove. Nora got in the back with Okafor, who had approximately 6 feet of leg and a tactical rig that took up most of the available space. Nobody asked her why she was in the car. She appreciated that. The Mercer Street satellite was 4 minutes from the main building under normal traffic. Vasquez made it in 2.5, which told Nora something about his driving history. She held the door handle, not out of fear, but because the shoulder didn't need any additional insult from lateral forces. What do we know about the secondary target? She asked. Rourke answered without looking back. Female, 31. She was present at a transaction 4 years ago, saw faces, heard names. She's been in protective status since the grand jury process started. Her location should have been secure. Should have been. Someone talked. Rourke said it flat, without editorializing. We don't know who or from where. Nora thought about Caldwell's call, about the part where he'd said the network moved faster than their intel, about the part where 3 other locations were currently at risk. How many people in the clinic right now? Okafor checked his phone. Building opened at 7. Estimate between 20 and 30 patients in waiting an exam, based on the schedule. Plus staff, probably 8 to 12 clinical. 30 to 40 civilians in a single-story building with limited internal partitions and 1 main entrance. Side entrance, she asked. Service door off the parking lot, usually alarmed. Usually? Yeah. Vasquez pulled off the main road and cut through a side street that brought them parallel to the building from the north. He stopped half a block short, which was the right call. Rourke was already on comms, coordinating with what sounded like a second team approaching from the south. We go in quiet, Rourke said to the group. No breach unless there's confirmed imminent harm. We do not want a hostage situation accelerating. She looked at Nora. You stay back until I clear it. If it's like this morning, they're not looking for a hostage situation. They're looking for one specific person. Everyone else is a variable. I know that. If they identify the target before you get in there, I know, Voss. Nora stopped. Rourke pulled her weapon, checked it, holstered it again. You stay back until I clear it, she repeated. If that changes, I'll tell you. She got out of the vehicle. Vasquez and Okafor followed. Nora got out last and stood on the sidewalk and watched them move toward the building's north-facing wall, low and fast. And she stood there with her hands at her sides in her hospital scrubs, while 30 to 40 civilians were inside a building that had at least one trained operative in it, and the particular quality of that standing still was the worst kind of hard. She started moving toward the building's service entrance. She told herself she was doing reconnaissance. She was close enough to the truth that she didn't spend time on it. The service entrance was on the east side of the building, set back from the parking lot by a short concrete alcove. The door had a push bar and a card reader and a small security camera mounted above the frame. The camera light was off, which was either a malfunction or wasn't. She stopped at the corner of the alcove and listened. Inside, the particular quality of silence that wasn't silence. Muffled voices, 2 or 3. The sound of something being moved. Not furniture, lighter than that. Equipment carts, maybe. She put her back against the concrete wall and thought about what she knew. Single story. 12 exam rooms arranged in 2 parallel corridors off a central spine, with the waiting area at the front. The staff area, nurses' station, supply room, break room, was clustered in the back quadrant near the service entrance. The physician offices were at the far end. If she were running this operation, she'd clear the waiting area first to control the largest concentration of civilians. Then split. 1 person to find the target, 1 to hold the room. 2 people minimum, probably not more than 3, because a larger team was harder to move quietly through a building with this much glass. The target was a woman named, Rourke hadn't given her a name. 31. She'd been in protective status, which meant she was either brought here under a cover identity or had a scheduled appointment under her protected alias. Nora thought about who she'd seen coming through the satellite clinic on her 2 previous shifts. It was a lower volume location than the main building, more routine care, a different demographic. The patients who came to the satellite tended to be people who wanted less waiting, less institutional wait. Younger adults, people with non-urgent needs, or people whose handler had decided a lower profile location was safer than the main building. The service door opened from the inside. She was already flat against the concrete wall, heart rate controlled, weight forward, before the door was halfway open. A woman came out. Scrubs, dark blue, clinic logo on the shoulder. Mid-50s, short gray hair, and an expression of someone trying to move quickly without looking like they were moving quickly. She didn't see Nora until she'd taken 3 steps into the alcove. She made a sound that wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a gasp. Nora put 1 finger against her own lips. The woman froze. "How many?" Nora said, voice barely audible. The woman stared at her for a moment with the expression of someone trying to decide if this was better or worse than what they'd just left. Then she held up 2 fingers. 2, Nora said quietly. The woman nodded. "Are they armed?" Another nod. "Where's the waiting area?" The woman pointed, front of the building, which Nora already knew. "Is everyone in the waiting area, or are they moving people?" The woman shook her head slightly, held up 2 fingers again, then made a separating gesture. They'd split then. 1 in the waiting area, 1 somewhere else. "Is there a patient? Woman, around 30, possibly came in alone this morning. Do you know who I'm talking about?" The woman looked at her, then nodded, slowly. "Where is she?" The woman pointed back toward the door. "Inside." Of course. Nora thought about Rourke's instruction. She thought about a woman in her 30s who had seen something she couldn't unsee and had been living in the architecture of that decision for 4 years. "Get to the road," she told the woman. "North side. There are federal agents at the corner. Go now." The woman went. Nora caught the service door before it closed. The back corridor of the satellite clinic was 30 feet long, lit by ceiling-mounted fluorescents. Supply room on the left, break room on the right, nurses' station at the T-junction where the corridor met the main spine. The nurses' station was empty. Computer screen still active, a half-full mug of coffee sitting next to the keyboard. She moved to the junction and looked both ways. To the right, toward the waiting area at the front, she could hear a man's voice doing the controlled, authoritative thing that people do when they're trying to manage a room full of scared civilians without triggering a stampede. She couldn't make out words, but she could hear the register. "Keep calm. Nobody moves. This will be over soon. all the language of people who needed a few more minutes of compliance. To the left, toward the exam rooms, she could hear nothing. Nothing was the more dangerous direction. She went left. The exam rooms were numbered 1 through 12, 6 on each side of a corridor that ended in a T at the physician offices. The doors were standard, hinged, with a small window at eye height. She moved down the corridor, staying close to the wall, checking through each window as she passed. 1, 2, 3. Empty. Empty. A patient who'd been told to stay put and was sitting on the exam table with their arms wrapped around themselves and their eyes wide. She kept moving. 7, 8. Empty. Empty. At 9, she stopped. Through the window, she could see a partial view of the interior. Exam table, supply cabinet on the near wall, blood pressure monitor on a rolling stand. And at the far edge of her viewing angle, the back of a man's head. He was standing, facing the far wall, which meant he was facing someone against the far wall. She moved to the other side of the door to get the opposite viewing angle. The window was small, and she had to tilt, which aggravated the shoulder, which she ignored. The woman was in the corner between the exam table and the supply cabinet. She was maybe 30, dark hair pulled back, and she was dressed in civilian clothes rather than a patient gown, which meant she'd either refused the gown or had been in the process of checking in when everything went sideways. Her face was very still in the way faces get when someone has decided that stillness is the only available option. The man between her and the door was not large, medium height, compact build, but he had the weapon in his right hand, and he was positioned in a way that covered the only exit. Nora ran the options in approximately 2 seconds. Rourke's team was entering from the north. She could hear, faintly, through the clinic's ventilation and the thin interior walls, the kind of micro sounds that preceded a tactical entry, the specific quality of organized movement getting close. 30 seconds, maybe 40, maybe less. If she waited 30 seconds, the man in room 9 had 30 seconds to decide the witness was a liability regardless of the outcome. If she opened the door and went in, she was entering a confined space against an armed subject with a compromised shoulder and no backup and no weapon. And she needed to cover the gap between the door and the man before he could reorient and fire, which was approximately 8 feet of open floor. 8 feet. She thought about the hallway at Harlow Creek, about the calculation she'd made outside room 218, about the way those calculations always felt like they should be harder than they were, and how that was something she'd stopped questioning somewhere around year 3. She opened the door. She went in low and fast and covered the 8 feet before he'd fully turned, and the thing that worked in her favor, the only thing, really, was that he'd been expecting a locked door and the door hadn't been locked, and that one additional half-second of recalibration was what the difference was made of. The collision was harder than the one in 218 because the space was smaller and there was no room to redirect, only to absorb and redirect weight, and the weapon went left while she went right, and they went into the supply cabinet together with enough force that the blood pressure monitor toppled off its stand and hit the floor in a crash that was definitely going to bring the second man running. She got her left forearm across his throat, and the shoulder screamed at her in a way that was no longer dull and had become extremely specific, but his weapon hand was pinned under her weight, and the woman in the corner, the witness, did something Nora had not predicted, which was that she grabbed the toppled blood pressure monitor by its cord and swung it at the man's head with the focused, furious energy of someone who had been afraid for a very long time and was done with it. The monitor connected with the side of his skull with a sound that was dense and final. He went out. Not dead, but out. Nora and the woman looked at each other for 1 second over the body between them. "Okay," the woman said, breathing hard. "Okay," Nora agreed. The shoulder was bad. She knew it was bad because she could feel the specific hot tightness that meant muscle rather than bone, which was manageable, but the range of motion had dropped to maybe 25%, and she could not lift that arm without a level of pain that would meaningfully affect her functional capacity, and she needed to know that clearly before the second man came through the door. He came through the door. He was bigger than the first one. He stopped in the doorway and took in the scene. Partner on the floor, the witness upright and holding a blood pressure monitor by the cord, and his eyes went to Nora, and something moved across his face that was the wrong kind of recognition. Not "who is this?" Something closer to "I've been told about this." "Voss," he said, her name in his mouth from a man she had never seen before in her life. She was still processing that when he leveled the weapon directly at her and said, "Step away from her." The witness took a half step backward into the corner. Nora held her position. She was between him and the witness, and she had exactly no good options and one very bad one, and the shoulder was at 25%, and the 8 feet between her and the door was not 8 feet she could cover before he fired. She looked at him. "You know my name," she said. "Move." "Who told you?" Something flickered across his expression. "Not much. Enough. This is your last warning." "You're not going to shoot me," she said. "You're here for the witness. I'm not your objective, and you know the rules. An additional body in a federal investigation doubles your exposure, and you've already lost your partner, which means the exit plan is compromised and you need to move fast, not add variables." He stared at her. "You knew my name before you walked through that door," she said. "That means someone briefed you on this building's personnel, and they told you specifically about me, which means they've been tracking this situation since this morning, and they know the timeline has gone wrong. You're not getting the witness out of this building. Your partner is down, the building is surrounded, and the only decision left is whether you walk out in custody or whether you do something that upgrades a trafficking charge to something that carries a very different kind of sentence." The sound of tactical boots in the corridor. Both of them heard it. His jaw moved. His grip on the weapon shifted by a fraction. And Nora watched the calculation move across his face. She could see it, the same way she'd been able to see it on the man in 218. The point where training ran into situation and the math stopped working out the way they'd told you it would. The door to exam room 9 came off its hinge. Rourke came through it with 2 agents behind her, and the man with the weapon was still pointing it at Nora when Vasquez got his arm from behind, and it was over in the same compressed, ungraceful, very non-cinematic way that these things actually ended. Not with a speech or a standoff, but with a joint lock and a controlled descent and someone's face against the linoleum while their hands were secured behind them. Nora stepped back. The witness was against the wall. She was still holding the blood pressure monitor by the cord. Her knuckles were white. Rourke looked at Nora, at the shoulder, at the man on the floor. "I told you to stay back," Rourke said. "She was running out of time. I had a team coming." 20 seconds later, Rourke looked at the witness, at the unconscious man from the supply cabinet, at the blood pressure monitor in the witness's hand. "Give me that," she said to the witness, not unkindly. The witness released it. Her hands were shaking now, which was the correct and human response to something she'd held off until the immediate danger passed. "She hit him," Nora said. "Not me." Rourke looked at the witness, who looked back with an expression somewhere between residual terror and something that was almost, around the edges, the beginning of a different emotion. Okafor was in the doorway doing a quick medical check on the unconscious man. Basic responsiveness, breathing, pupils. He looked up. "He'll be okay." "Good," Rourke said. "Get both of them out." She was looking at the weapon on the floor, at the way the room was arranged, at the logistics of what had just happened. Then she turned to Nora. "You need that shoulder looked at. I need 5 minutes." "You need more than 5 minutes. You need imaging." "Not yet." Nora turned to the witness. "What's your name?" The woman looked at her. "Lena," she said. "Lena Durst." "Lena, I'm Nora. Are you hurt?" "No." She paused. "Are you?" "I'll manage." Nora looked at her shoulder, then back at Lena's face. "You're going to be moved to a more secure location. Don't argue with them about it." "I'm not going to argue." Lena looked at the man on the floor. "I've been arguing for 4 years. I'm done arguing." Rourke guided Lena toward the door. Vasquez was there. He had a hand on the second man's arm and was doing the professional, efficient movement toward the exit that the situation required. Nora stood in the middle of exam room 9, in her hospital scrubs, with her left shoulder at maybe 20% and falling. And the room smelled like antiseptic and upset equipment and the specific aftermath of a short, violent thing in a small space, and she became aware that her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear. From the come-down. The particular neurological aftermath of sustained high-function readiness that expressed itself, when the immediate threat was gone, in the extremities first. She pressed her right hand flat against her thigh and breathed through it. This was the part nobody trained you for, not because it was complicated, but because it was ordinary. You came down and you shook a little and you were tired in a way that was different from physical tired. And then you went back to doing whatever came next because the alternative wasn't an alternative. She became aware that Rourke was still in the room. "Your name," Rourke said. Not a question. Nora looked at her. "The man knew your name before he walked through the door," Rourke said. "I heard it from outside." "Yes. That means the network has intelligence on the personnel in this building." Rourke's voice was level, controlled in the way that meant she was working to keep it that way. "How would they have your name?" Nora didn't answer immediately. "Voss?" Rourke took one step toward her. "I need to understand what I'm working with here. I have 2 secured witnesses, 4 detained operatives, a potential information leak inside my own operation, and a civilian nurse who has now single-handedly neutralized 3 armed subjects in 2 locations in the same morning." She stopped. "I've had the clearance to pull your real file for the last 40 minutes. I haven't pulled it because I've been doing my job. I'm going to pull it in about 10 minutes when I get back to my vehicle, and I'd rather hear what's in it from you." The corridor outside was moving again. Agents, the contained aftermath of the building's worth of frightened people. Someone speaking in the calm, practiced voice of crisis de-escalation to the waiting area at the front. Nora looked at the wall, at the toppled blood pressure monitor on the floor, at the chair in the corner of the exam room where an ordinary patient had sat that morning doing something ordinary, reading a magazine or checking their phone, having an ordinary day that had then become this. "The file is classified above your current access level," she said. "What you'd get is the cover version." "I know." "What you'd see is Navy Medical Service, honorable discharge, and a 4-year gap that attributes to contract medical work in non-specified international locations. What would I not see?" The building had gotten quieter. Outside, she could hear the approach of additional vehicles. 8 years of special operations attachment, Nora said. Sniper qualified. Tactical medical, combat application, not civilian. 3 tours in theaters I'm not going to name in a hallway, even an empty one. She paused. "I was released from active assignment 4 years ago under a mutual agreement that kept certain operational details out of the public record." Rourke was very still. "The call sign in my file," Nora continued, "if you reach someone with the clearance to tell you, is Wren." She turned to look at her. "Not because it suited me, because I was good at getting into small spaces." Something moved in Rourke's expression. Not surprise exactly. More like the specific look of a person whose suspicion has just been confirmed and who is now reorganizing around the confirmed version. "The man knew your name," Rourke said again, slowly. "Not your call sign, your name." "I know." "That's a different kind of intelligence leak. That's not someone who found a personnel file. That's someone who knew specifically who Nora Voss was and where she worked and matched that to Wren." Rourke's jaw tightened slightly. "How many people knew that connection? 6? Maybe 7? People you trust?" Nora looked at her. "People I trusted," she said. The silence between those 2 words was the specific kind that didn't need elaboration. Rourke pulled out her radio. She stopped before she keyed it. "The man who called you this morning," she said, "before I arrived at your station." Nora went very still. Rourke's eyes were steady. "Your body language changed when you came back out of that supply room. I clocked it. And you moved differently for the rest of the time we were at the main building, like someone who'd received new information and was sitting with the weight of it." She was very good at her job. Nora filed that. "His name is Caldwell," Nora said. "Marcus Caldwell. He was my last handler before separation." "What did he tell you?" "That the network was larger than one witness. That you had 3 locations at risk. That someone had talked." She paused. "He wanted me to have context before you came to me." Rourke looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that was doing a lot of work in a short amount of time. "He called you before I came to you," Rourke said slowly, "which means he knew I was coming to you, which means he's monitoring my operation." "That's one reading. What's the other reading?" "That he's monitoring the network," Nora said. "And the network is monitoring your operation. And he wanted me to know that before you did." Rourke's radio crackled. The voice on the other end said something in a clipped, low register that Nora couldn't hear clearly, but she could read the change in Rourke's face as she listened, and the change was the kind that preceded very bad news stated in very professional language. Rourke lowered the radio. She looked at Nora. "Declan Ferris," she said, "the witness at the main building. Nora felt the shoulder, the hands, the whole tired weight of the morning, and none of it mattered. What happened? Brennan called it in 30 seconds ago. Rourke's voice was completely controlled and completely without color. The floor at Harlow Creek, Maine. Someone got through. Nora was already moving before Rourke finished the sentence. Not running. Running attracted attention and consumed energy without purpose. She moved the way she'd learned to move in confined operational environments. Fast, deliberate, each step placed with intention, the body doing the work without the mind spending anything extra on it. Rourke was 2 steps behind her and on the radio simultaneously, which was an impressive coordination of tasks. Brennan, give me a sit rep. What do you mean someone got through? The radio crackled as they pushed through the service door and back into the parking lot. We had a code blue called on the 3rd floor. I took 2 agents up to assist. Hospital protocol, staff said cardiac event. And when we came back down, the floor was different. Ferris's door was open. Define different. Someone had moved through it. The nurse at the station, the charge nurse. She said a man in a physician's coat went into 218 approximately 4 minutes after we went upstairs. She assumed he was attending staff. Rourke looked at Nora as they reached the SUV. Code blue, on the 3rd floor. There is no cardiac unit on the 3rd floor, Nora said. It's administrative, records, billing, HR. Rourke's jaw tightened by exactly 1 degree. It was a diversion. Yes. They were in the vehicle. Vasquez had the engine running before the doors closed. Okafor was on a separate radio coordinating the transport of Lena Durst to a secondary secure location. Is Ferris alive? Nora asked. Rourke relayed the question. Brennan's voice came back. Unknown. 218 is empty. Ferris is not on the floor. We're doing a building sweep now. Empty. Not a body, not a scene, empty. Which meant either Ferris had been moved by the network, which required inside help and a clean exit, or Ferris had moved himself, which required that he'd understood what was happening and had enough functional mobility to act on it. She thought about the man she'd seen in 218 that morning, the bandaged forearm, the weeks of bad sleep behind his eyes, the way he'd said thank you with the voice of someone who hadn't said it in a long time. He ran, she said. Rourke looked at her. He didn't wait. He saw the physician's coat, and he ran. Nora looked out the window at the street passing. Where would he go? He has a handler. His handler is your team, and your team just went to the 3rd floor. She said it without inflection because this was not the moment for anything else. He's alone in a building he doesn't know, in a city that's tried to kill him 3 times, with a compromised arm and no phone because your protocol takes phones at admission. Rourke was quiet for 2 seconds. Where would he go? She said. Not to Nora, to herself. Ground floor, Nora said. Not the main entrance, too exposed. He's been briefed on basic evasion or he wouldn't have survived this long. He'd look for a secondary exit that wasn't the one he came in through. Loading dock, Vasquez said from the front. Loading dock, Nora agreed. Rourke relayed it to Brennan. Vasquez pushed the SUV back toward the main building at a speed that was again clarifying about his prior professional history. Nora held the door handle. The shoulder had moved into a new category of unpleasant that she was actively not thinking about, because thinking about it would mean allocating attention to it, and attention was currently a finite resource. She thought instead about the code blue diversion, about the specificity of it, 3rd floor, administrative, no cardiac unit, a call that would pull federal agents upstairs without triggering a full building response, because a code blue in a hospital was credible and urgent, and exactly the kind of thing trained personnel responded to without stopping to verify. Someone had known the protective details configuration well enough to predict that a code blue would move them. Someone had known the floor layout well enough to call a plausible location. Someone had known the timing well enough to have a man in a physician's coat ready to walk into 218 in the 4-minute window. The network's intelligence on this operation was not incidental. It was structural. She thought about Caldwell's call, about his voice saying someone talked, about the particular weight of a pause that comes before something you've calculated but would prefer not to say. She thought about the 6 or 7 people who had known the connection between Nora Voss and Wren. The SUV pulled into the main building's ambulance bay, and Rourke was out before it stopped fully. Nora followed. The lobby of Harlow Creek Medical Center had acquired the additional controlled chaos of a building that had been on security alert for 2 hours, extra staff visible. A uniformed officer at the front entrance who hadn't been there this morning, a cluster of patients near the waiting area who had the look of people who'd been told to stay put and were increasingly resistant to that instruction. Nora went through the side entrance, up the stairs, not because the second floor was the destination, but because the stairwell was faster than the elevator and she needed to think vertically about the building, where someone on foot, injured, no phone, maximum threat environment, would move. She came out on the second floor. Sandra was at the nurse's station, and Sandra's face when she saw Nora had a quality she hadn't seen on it before, something past professional concern, something that was just worry, plain, and without the management layer over it. "Ferris," Nora said. "He came past the station about 8 minutes ago, moving fast, hospital gown, one hand holding his arm." Sandra looked at her. "I tried to stop him." "What did he say?" "He said, 'They're already inside.'" Sandra paused. "I called security." "Which direction?" "East stairwell." East stairwell went to the ground floor service corridor that ran behind the kitchen and the laundry facility and came out at the loading dock. Vasquez had been right. She went east. The ground floor service corridor was the part of Harlow Creek that patients never saw. Unfinished walls, exposed conduit, the smell of industrial detergent and food service equipment, fluorescent lighting with no design consideration whatsoever. She came out of the stairwell door into it and stood still for 3 seconds listening. Footsteps. One set, moving fast but not evenly. A hitch in the rhythm that came from favoring one side, east toward the loading dock. She followed. The loading dock was a large, low-ceilinged space with 2 rolling bay doors and a smaller personnel door on the left side. One bay door was partially open, the gap suggesting someone who'd gone under it rather than raised it fully. She could see morning light through the gap. She didn't go to the gap. She went to the personnel door on the left and opened it. The loading area outside was a concrete pad with a chain-link perimeter and 2 delivery truck hookups. Declan Ferris was at the far corner of the chain-link fence, where the fence met the building's east wall, and he was trying to work a section of fence that had previously been cut and rewired, the kind of maintenance gap that accumulated in institutional perimeters over years and that nobody got around to fixing. He'd found it. That spoke to something. He heard the door and spun around. In the hospital gown, with the bandaged arm and the expression of a man running on a week's worth of accumulated cortisol, he looked terrible. But he was upright, and his eyes were clear, and when he saw her, the recognition was immediate. "Nurse," his voice was rough. "Nora." "Stop pulling on the fence," she said. "You'll open the wound." He didn't stop immediately. Then he stopped. "There's someone in a physician's coat." "I know. He's not in this building anymore." She wasn't certain of that, but it was the most probable status, and certainty wasn't available. So she offered probability in a voice that left no room for it to be questioned. "Come back inside." "Last time I went back inside." "Last time your security detail was pulled upstairs by a false alarm." "That won't happen again." She moved toward him. "You've been running on that arm for 8 minutes. Is it bleeding?" He looked down at the bandage. The outer wrap had a spreading stain on it. Not large, but present. "Yeah, a little." "Then come inside." He looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that was really an assessment of whether the thing being offered was real or was the next version of something that had already gone wrong 4 times. She held it without moving. He came away from the fence. They went back through the personnel door. She had him sit on a materials handling pallet inside the loading dock while she found, through the same kind of inventory habit that had served her twice already that morning, a first aid kit mounted on the wall near the bay doors. Basic kit, building standard, but it had gauze and tape and saline rinse, which was enough. "Hold still," she said. She checked the bandage without fully removing it. The original wound was a clean laceration on the forearm, sutured and wrapped. The sutures were intact. The bleeding was superficial from the physical exertion, not structural. She reinforced the wrap with the gauze from the kit and taped it clean. His hands were shaking. She didn't mention it. "The man who came into my room," he said. "He said he was the new attending." "What did you notice about him?" Ferris thought about it. He was trying to hold himself steady. "Shoes," he said after a moment. "His shoes were wrong. Attendings wear, I don't know, regular shoes. His had this specific kind of sole. like work boots, but not. The kind that he stopped. I don't know how to describe it. Tactical sole, rubber, thick grip, designed for non-slip in multiple surfaces. She finished taping the wrap. You noticed that. I notice things now. He said it without pride. 4 years of noticing things. She sat back on her heels. The testimony you're carrying, Rourke's team said 3 states, 4 years of operations. How much of it is you specifically, and how much is documented? He looked at her carefully. Why? Because the network sent 4 operatives to 2 locations in one morning. That's not a routine suppression effort. That's an operation with a deadline. Something is happening in the case timeline that's making them move now. He was quiet. Declan. She kept her voice level. I'm not a federal agent. I can't compel you to tell me anything. But I've put my shoulder through a wall twice this morning, and I'd like to understand why. Something shifted in his face. A small, involuntary release. The particular quality of a man who had been carrying something alone for a very long time and was encountering someone who was asking the actual question. Grand jury, he said. They moved the date up, 2 weeks from today. He looked at his hands. If I testify, there are 12 people in 3 states who get indicted, including 2 who have been moving money through legitimate medical facilities. He paused. Including the medical director of a regional hospital network. Nora went still. Which network? She asked. Harlow Creek is one of 6 facilities under the Pacific Northwest Health Consortium umbrella, he said. The medical director of the consortium is named Gerald Park. The name landed on her like a flat weight. Gerald Park. Dennis Park. Different first names. Different enough that she'd had no reason to connect them when the administrator had come through the door 2 hours ago, breathing hard from the stairs. She stood up. Stay here, she said. Don't move, and don't talk to anyone who isn't Rourke or me. What? Stay here. Here. She went back into the service corridor and called Rourke. Rourke picked up on the second ring. I have Ferris, Nora said. Loading dock, ground floor east. He's okay. I need you to run a name, Dennis Park. Hospital administrator at Harlow Creek, Maine. Cross-reference against the consortium board and against Gerald Park, the medical director. A pause on the line. Where are you getting Gerald Park? Rourke asked. Ferris just told me. A longer pause. Gerald Park is on our sealed indictment list. He's one of the 12. Dennis Park arrived at this building this morning immediately after the incident. He went directly to the second floor. She made herself go slowly because speed caused errors, and this mattered. He would have seen the configuration of your team. He would have seen where Brennan was stationed. He would have known the floor layout and the staff locations. Voss? He was here for at least 40 minutes. His phone was in his hand when he arrived. She thought about the cluster of conversations she'd seen. Park with Holt, Park with hospital security, Park moving through the floor with the completely plausible authority of a hospital administrator doing his job in a crisis. He had everything he needed to make a call and coordinate a code blue diversion. The line was quiet for 4 seconds. We need to find him, Rourke said. He's still in the building. He wouldn't leave before he knew whether the operation succeeded. Another pause. How do you know that? Because he's not operational. He's administrative. He wouldn't have a personal exit plan for a situation where the hit succeeded. He'd want to be here, doing exactly what an innocent administrator would do, which is managing the aftermath. The sound of Rourke moving, relaying instructions to someone nearby in a low voice. Then back to Nora. I'm sending Okafor to the loading dock for Ferris. Don't move him yourself. Understood. And Voss. Yeah. When I find Park, I want you with me. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. She went back to Ferris and told him an agent was coming. She stood at the loading dock entrance until Okafor appeared. 2 minutes, which was fast. And then she handed Ferris over with a look that said, I meant what I said about not moving. And she went back into the service corridor and up the east stairwell and out onto the second floor. The floor had changed again in her absence. Rourke's remaining agents had pulled into a tighter configuration, and the staff who were still present had acquired the particular quality of people who knew something else had happened and were processing it in the residual silence between tasks. Tomas was at the nurse's station looking at a chart with the focus of someone who needed a chart to look at. Sandra was on the phone. Dr. Raymond Holt was standing near the window at the end of the corridor. He saw Nora come off the stairwell. He watched her walk past him without speaking. His expression had changed across the course of the morning, in increments she hadn't fully tracked until now. The dismissiveness had gone somewhere, replaced by something she couldn't immediately name. She filed it and kept moving. Dennis Park was on the third floor. She found this out from the security officer at the stairwell landing. A different officer from Gerald, someone she didn't recognize, who told her the administrator had gone up about 20 minutes ago to speak with the records department about the incident documentation. Third floor. Administrative records, where the false code blue had been called from. She climbed to the third floor. The administrative wing was a corridor of offices and conference rooms that had the particular mid-morning stillness of a floor that had been disrupted and not quite resettled. Several office doors were open. A woman at the far end was speaking on a phone in a lowered voice. The records department was 3 doors down on the left. Dennis Park was not in the records department. He was in the small conference room across from it, sitting at the table with his phone face down in front of him and his jacket folded over the chair beside him. And he looked up when she opened the door with the expression of a man who had been waiting for something and was uncertain which version of it had just arrived. He registered her scrubs, her badge, the shoulder she was holding at a slightly wrong angle. "Ms. Voss," he said, not quite casual, somewhere adjacent to it. "I heard you were involved in the situation downstairs. Are you all right?" She stepped into the room and left the door open behind her because she wanted the sight line and because she wanted him to have the option to feel like the door was open. "I'm fine," she said. "I was looking for you, actually." "For me?" "We had a couple of questions about the incident response. The federal team wanted to speak with all the administrative staff who were present during the alert." She kept her voice professional, the voice of a nurse following up on a process item. "Do you have a few minutes?" He looked at her for a moment. Something worked behind his eyes that was subtle enough that she would have missed it 6 years ago and didn't miss now. "Of course," he said. She sat down across from him. She didn't reach for a phone or a notebook, just sat. "When did you arrive this morning?" she asked. "I got the call around 7:30. I was here by 8. "The call from who?" "Hospital security. They notify me when we activate an incident protocol." "Gerald," she said, a slight pause. "Gerald Britton, yes. He's the morning security supervisor." "Have you spoken with him since you arrived?" Another pause, this one a fraction longer. "Briefly, when I first came in." "About what?" "The status of the floor, standard briefing." He folded his hands on the table. The gesture was composed, controlled. "Can I ask why a nurse is conducting this interview rather than one of the federal agents?" "They're managing the primary witness situation. I'm just doing preliminary collection." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Park, do you have family in the medical administration space? The name is reasonably common in the sector." The question landed. She watched it land. His hands on the table did not move, which was the tell, because a person who genuinely had no reason to care about that question would have some small physical response, some micro shift of the "I'm not sure where this is going" variety. Stillness, in this context, was the product of active suppression. "I have a cousin in Seattle," he said. "Different field." "What field?" "Finance." "What's the cousin's name?" He looked at her. The professional composure was still there, but it had developed a hairline fracture, not visible in his expression, but in the quality of the stillness, which had crossed from controlled to rigid. "I'm not sure why that's relevant," he said. "Probably isn't," she said. "I just find that families tend to cluster in related fields even when the specifics differ. My family was all military medical." She said it deliberately, watching for the register of military medical in his face. She saw it. It was small, a single blink that ran a quarter-second long, and the eyes that came back from it were fractionally recalibrated, re-aimed at her with a different kind of attention than they'd been carrying before. He knew what she was. Not the specifics, but the category. Someone had told him. The same someone who had told the man in exam room 9 her name. She held his gaze and did not look away. "Mr. Park," she said, "I want to be honest with you. Please." The federal team has pulled the call logs from the administrative floor for the last 4 hours. They've also pulled the IP records for the code blue call that went out at 9:17. She paused. The call was routed through the third-floor records department, from a terminal that requires administrator-level credentials to access. The hairline fracture widened. That's a system error, he said. Those terminals have had access control issues. They pulled the credential log. The login was specific. She kept her voice even. It was yours. It wasn't. She didn't know whose login it was. But she needed him to make a decision in the next 30 seconds, because Rourke was on her way up, and the window for this was short. Dennis Park looked at the table. He looked at his phone, face down, and she watched him calculate whether the phone was a resource or a liability, and she watched him decide it was a liability, and she watched him decide not to reach for it. And then his shoulders dropped by approximately 3 centimeters. Not a confession, not a statement, just the particular physical grammar of a man who has finished holding something that had become too heavy. "I need to speak with an attorney," he said. "That's your right," she said. "Absolutely." She didn't move. She's kept her hands on the table. She looked at him with the same steady attention she'd been giving him since she sat down. Not confrontational, not triumphant, just present. "The men who came into this building," she said quietly. "The ones who went after Ferris. One of them knew my name before he walked through the door." She paused. "Someone gave it to him. Someone with access to this building's personnel files and enough knowledge of the federal operation to know I was a variable worth flagging." She paused again. "That's going to be in the credential logs too, Mr. Park." He said nothing. "The 2 witnesses your network tried to reach this morning are both alive and in federal custody," she said. 4 of your operatives are in custody. The grand jury date is 2 weeks out, and it hasn't moved." She let that sit for a moment. "Whatever you were told this morning's operation would accomplish, it didn't." He looked up. His face had the quality of a man looking at the arithmetic of a situation and finding that every calculation he'd been running for the last several hours had been based on assumptions that no longer held. It wasn't a dramatic expression. It was a tired one. The kind of tired that was very different from the kind you slept off. The door behind her opened. Rourke walked in. She took in the room in one sweep. Nora at the table, Park across from her, the phone face down, the jacket over the chair, the specific configuration of a conversation that had reached a particular point. And she stopped behind Nora's left shoulder. "Mr. Park," she said, "I'm Special Agent Diane Rourke. I'd like you to come with me." Park looked at Nora for one more second. She met it without expression. He pushed back his chair and stood, and as he picked up his jacket from the chair beside him, his hand bumped the table edge and his phone slid sideways, and in the half-second before Rourke stepped forward, Nora saw the screen light up with the movement, a text notification. Visible for 2 seconds before the screen dimmed. She read it in those 2 seconds because she'd spent 11 years training herself to read things fast and under pressure. And what the text said was 6 words that landed in the center of her chest like a cold weight. Wren confirmed. Package still in building. The package was not Ferris. Ferris was at the loading dock with Okafor. She ran the building in her head, every floor, every exit, every person she'd placed in the last 3 hours. Sandra on the 2nd floor. Tomas at the nurse's station. Pellerin recovered by the station. Holt at the window. Lena Durst, the witness from the satellite clinic, had been transported to a secondary secure location, or she was supposed to have been. "Rourke," she said. Her voice came out level because she made it. "Where is Lena Durst right now?" Rourke looked at her with a fraction of a second of confusion that told Nora the answer before she said it. "Vasquez took her out 20 minutes ago. She's at the secondary." She stopped. Her hand went to the radio. "Vasquez, confirm status on Durst." Static. Then, "Agent Vasquez is not on this channel." The room was very quiet. Rourke's face went through something that was professional control over something else entirely. And then her hand was off the radio and she was on her phone, and Dennis Park was still standing by his chair with his jacket in his hands. And Nora was looking at the text on the phone screen that had gone dark again, and she was thinking about the word package and the word confirmed and the specific use of her call sign by someone who knew what it meant. Rourke lowered her phone. Her jaw was set. "Vasquez's last confirmed position was the satellite clinic parking lot," she said, 22 minutes ago. 22 minutes. The drive from Mercer Street to any secondary location was 8 minutes at normal traffic, 14 at worst. "He never left the parking lot," Nora said. "No." "Someone was waiting." "Yes." The 2 words between them were doing a great deal of work, and underneath the work there was a very specific and very cold reality. The network had not failed this morning. The 4 operatives in custody were not the whole operation. They were the front, sent in knowing they would likely be contained, buying time and drawing attention while something else moved into position around the edges. And Lena Durst, who had swung a blood pressure monitor with 4 years of accumulated fury and survived 3 hours of the worst morning of her life, was somewhere in this city right now, with someone who knew Nora's name. Rourke was already moving toward the door. "I need you," she said. Nora stood. Her shoulder was at 15% and falling. She had been running on the same adrenaline cycle for 3 hours without food or water or anything resembling a moment to reset, and the situation had just opened in a direction that was worse than anything the morning had presented so far. She stood, and she followed, because Lena Durst had asked her, "Are you okay in exam room 9?" with genuine concern. And that was the kind of thing that stayed with you. She was halfway to the door when her phone rang. Unknown number. She stopped, answered. The voice on the other end was not Caldwell. It was a woman's voice, low and controlled, and it said, "Nora Voss, we have the witness. We also have something else." A pause. "We have the name of the person inside Rourke's operation who's been feeding us information for the last 8 months. Nora stood completely still. "If you want both," the voice said, "come alone." Nora kept the phone against her ear and did not move. Rourke had stopped 3 steps ahead of her and turned back, reading something in the quality of the stillness that had come over Nora's body. The conference room was quiet except for the sound of Dennis Park's breathing and the distant, ordinary noise of a hospital floor doing its work 1 story below. "Where?" Nora said. "There's a parking structure on Clement Avenue, level 3, northeast corner. You have 40 minutes. A pause that was not uncertainty, but emphasis. "Come alone and we talk. Come with the federal team and the witness doesn't make it to the car." The line went dead. Nora lowered the phone. Rourke crossed the room in 4 steps. "Who was that?" "The network." Nora kept her voice even. "They have Durst. They're offering a trade. Location of the witness, plus the name of the leak inside your operation, in exchange for a direct meeting." Rourke's face did not change visibly. What changed was the quality of the air around her. "With you specifically." "With me specifically." "Why you?" "Because they've been tracking me since this morning, and they know I'm not an agent, which means I can't make operational decisions on behalf of the federal investigation, which means meeting with me is lower stakes for them than meeting with you." Nora paused. "Or they want to use me as leverage." "Against what?" "Against you." She looked at Rourke directly. "The offer of the leak's name. That's the real bait. If they give you a name, it controls who you look at. It can be used to protect the actual source by pointing you toward someone else." Rourke was quiet for a moment. Her jaw worked slightly. "You think the name they'd give us is false?" "I think it might be. Or it might be real, and they're willing to sacrifice a mid-level asset to get something more valuable in return." She paused. "Either way, they want this meeting to happen, and they want it to happen with me, which means there's something they think they can get from me that they can't get any other way." "They think they can turn you," Rourke said. Not a question. "They know my background. They know I separated under a mutual agreement. They're going to try to offer me something that sounds like a way back in, or a way out." Nora thought about the woman's voice on the phone, controlled, calibrated, the voice of someone who had run this kind of conversation before. They've done their research. What do you want to do? The question surprised her. Not because it was wrong, but because it was genuine. Rourke was actually asking, not managing. "I want to go," Nora said, "with a wire and with your team positioned outside the structure. Not close, outside the block. If they see tactical near the entrance, they'll abort, and Durst is in a worse position." She paused. "And I need something from you first." "Name it." The real list of people who had access to the operational details of this case. The ones who could have been the leak. Rourke looked at her for a long moment. "That's classified well above your clearance." "I know." Nora held her gaze. "Give it to me anyway." Another moment. Then Rourke reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Actual paper, same as the notebook earlier. The habit of someone who'd learned to keep the most sensitive information off systems that could be accessed, and held it out. Nora unfolded it. 7 names. She read them once, the way she'd been trained to read things that needed to stay in her head rather than on paper, and she handed it back. One of the names was Marcus Caldwell. She had already considered that. She filed the consideration and moved past it, because the warehouse of things she couldn't afford to feel in the next 40 minutes was getting crowded and she needed the floor space for other things. They put a wire on her in the stairwell, a small device that Okafor produced from a kit in his vest, adhered to her collarbone under her scrubs, with the kind of practiced speed that said this was not the first time he'd done this under field conditions. Rourke gave her an earpiece the size of a grain of rice that seated so cleanly she almost forgot it was there. "If you say the words I understand, I'm treating it as a duress signal and we move," Rourke said. "Otherwise we hold position until you have eyes on Durst and confirmation of status." "Understood." "Voss." Rourke put a hand briefly on her right arm, the good one, not a gesture she'd been expecting. "You don't owe these people anything. You know that." "I know," Nora said. She went down the stairs and out through the main entrance and walked 3 blocks to where a staff shuttle bus was idling, which she took to the transit hub. And from the transit hub she walked because the parking structure on Clement Avenue was 7 minutes on foot, and she needed those 7 minutes to think. The city was doing its ordinary mid-morning things around her. Delivery trucks, coffee shop lines, a man walking a dog that didn't want to walk. The gap between the ordinary texture of a city going about its business and the specific weight of what she was walking toward was something she'd experienced many times in many places, and she had never fully decided whether the gap was comforting or unbearable, and she still hadn't decided by the time she turned onto Clement and saw the parking structure's concrete facade 3/4 of a block ahead. Level 3, northeast corner. She took the stairs because elevators were commitment points. You couldn't change direction in an elevator. And she came out onto the 3rd level into the particular cold concrete smell of a parking structure in the morning, oil and condensate, and the specific dead air of a space designed for function without any thought for anything else. The northeast corner was mostly empty. 2 vehicles, a dark sedan and a white panel van with no markings. She cataloged the van first because vans had interiors you couldn't see, and then she cataloged the sedan, and then she looked past both of them to the woman standing near the corner barrier. Not the voice from the phone. A different woman. 50s, well-dressed in a way that didn't match the location, dark coat, hands visible and empty. The body language of someone who had arranged the space and was waiting in it with the patient quality of someone accustomed to waiting. 10 feet to her left, sitting on the concrete floor with her back against the barrier wall, was Lena Durst. Her hands were secured with a zip tie in front of her. She was conscious, and when she saw Nora, her expression moved through several things very quickly and landed on something that looked, against all reasonable odds, like relief. Nora did not look at Lena for more than 2 seconds. She looked at the woman in the dark coat. "You came alone," the woman said. "You said to. And you listened." The woman's voice was the same one from the phone, controlled, calibrated, expensive, in the specific way of people who had spent a long time learning how to make their voice work for them. "That tells me something." "What does it tell you?" "That you're practical." The woman looked at her shoulder, the way Nora was holding it, the slight forward hunch that she couldn't entirely correct anymore. "You're hurt." "I've been hurt before." "Yes." The woman seemed to weigh something. "Do you know who I am?" "No." "My name is Vera Strand. I was the Pacific Northwest Regional Director of a logistics network you spent this morning trying to dismantle." She said it without drama. Factual, almost. The tone of a business briefing. "I want you to understand the scope of what you interrupted." "I'm listening." Strand moved a step to the right, which put her fractionally closer to Lena and fractionally further from the sedan. Nora tracked it. "The network you call a trafficking operation is more complicated than that framing suggests," Strand said. "We move people. Some of them are moved against their preference. I don't pretend otherwise. But we also move information and resources and people who are moving towards something rather than away from it, and the federal case that your witness is central to does not capture that complexity." She paused. "I'm not asking you to excuse it. I'm asking you to consider that there is an offer on the table that is worth hearing. You said you'd give me the name of the leak inside the federal operation." "I will, and I'll release the woman." Strand looked at Lena without apparent emotion. "In exchange for 24 hours. "Of what?" "Of you not speaking to anyone about this meeting. Not Rourke, not your former handler, not anyone. 24 hours is enough time for certain things to be moved that cannot be moved otherwise." Nora looked at her. Evidence? She said. Strand smiled very slightly. Witnesses, documents. The kind of material that, if it reaches the grand jury in 2 weeks, results in 12 indictments. If it doesn't reach the grand jury, it results in a much quieter resolution. She paused. You're not an agent. You have no legal obligation to report this conversation to anyone. You could walk away from Harlow Creek Medical Center today and go back to your life and none of this would touch you. The 2 people I helped this morning would be dead. They're not dead. That outcome is already off the table. Strand gestured slightly. I'm talking about the next 2 weeks. The grand jury. The indictments. She looked at Nora steadily. 12 people, Ms. Voss. 12 names on a sealed list. 2 of them are genuinely dangerous. The rest are administrators, finance people, mid-level facilitators who made bad decisions and have families, and who will lose everything if this proceeds. She let that sit for a moment. Your silence for 24 hours is worth more to me than you can calculate. The earpiece was very small and very quiet. Rourke was listening. Rourke's team was outside the block. Nora thought about the 7 names on the paper. She thought about the one that was Marcus Caldwell, who had called her this morning to give her context before Rourke arrived, who had known Rourke was coming, who had known the timeline and the location, and who had used a pause the way he always used pauses, to deliver information he'd already calculated the weight of. She thought about what Strand was actually offering. Not 24 hours of silence. A test. A read on whether Nora Voss, former operative, civilian nurse, the woman who had neutralized 4 of their people in one morning, was a person who could be managed. You said you'd give me the name of the leak, Nora said, in exchange for, give me the name first. Strand looked at her. The calibration in her expression shifted by a degree. That's not how this works, Strand said. It is now. Nora held her position. Because here's what I know, Vera. The name you're going to give me is either real or it isn't. If it's real, you're burning an asset you can no longer protect, which means that asset is already burned. Someone already gave you up somewhere down the line, and you're trying to trade a liability for a benefit. If it's false, you're trying to point the federal investigation at the wrong person, which buys you time but doesn't buy you safety. She paused. Either way, the name you give me tells me which one it is, and you know I'll know the difference. Strand was quiet for 4 seconds. Lena Durst had gone very still against the barrier wall. Marcus Caldwell, Strand said. Nora didn't move. He's been reporting to us since month 3 of the investigation, Strand continued. Timeline, witness locations, operational decisions. The code blue diversion this morning was his design. He provided the layout, the credential access information, and the personnel files. She paused. Including yours. She let it land. Nora absorbed it the way she absorbed things that needed to be absorbed while standing up. Not without weight, not without something that was not quite pain and not quite anger, but was in the neighborhood of both. But with the part of her that had learned over a long time that the immediate response was not always the useful one. He called me this morning, she said, before Rourke came to me. I know. That was his choice, not ours. Strand looked at her with something that was, improbably, close to honesty. I believe he was trying to warn you. There are people in this network who saw you as a variable to be eliminated. Caldwell argued against it. She paused. That may or may not change how you feel about what he did. It didn't change anything, and it changed everything. Those 2 facts could both be true, and she didn't have to resolve them right now. The 24 hours, Nora said. Strand's expression moved slightly towards something that might have been relief. I won't give you 24 hours, Nora said. I won't give you 24 minutes. I won't give you anything, Vera, because the 12 people on that sealed indictment list are not my responsibility, and neither is the complexity of your network's logistics. And the 2 things I know with clarity today are that Lena Durst is going to walk out of this structure and Marcus Caldwell is going to answer for what he did. She paused. And you are going to release her right now. Strand looked at her. The alternative, Nora said, is that the federal team currently positioned outside this block comes in, and you lose the one thing you came here to negotiate with. You said you came alone. I said I'd come alone. I didn't say I came unwired. The 4 seconds that followed were the kind that stretched. Strand's face moved through something that was genuine calculation, not panic, not dramatics, the actual arithmetic of a person running options against outcomes in real time. The sedan to her right. The van. Lena against the wall. the block outside. Then she reached into her coat pocket, produced a small folding knife, and walked to Lena and cut the zip tie. Lena stood up. Her legs were unsteady. She'd been on that floor for 40 minutes, and she got her balance in the particular determined way of someone who refused to need more than a second to get it. She looked at Nora. "Go to the stairwell," Nora said. "Now." Lena went. Nora did not watch her go because she was watching Strand, who had stepped back and was looking at Nora with an expression that had settled into something she hadn't seen on it before. "You're not going to run," Nora said. "No." Strand folded the knife and put it back in her pocket. "I'm not." "Why?" Strand looked at her for a moment. "Because the version of this that involves running ends very badly for a great many people I'm responsible for, and the version that involves cooperating," she stopped, "has a chance of being better. That's not the reason." Strand looked at her. Something in the woman's face, beneath all the layers of the controlled and calculated, shifted, just slightly, just enough. "No," Strand said quietly. "It's not the only reason." She didn't say what the other reason was, and Nora didn't ask, because the stairwell door was opening and Rourke was coming through it with Vasquez and Okafor behind her, and the parking structure filled with the organized, purposeful sound of a situation being resolved by people with the authority to resolve it. Rourke stopped beside Nora and looked at Strand. "Vera Strand," she said, "you're under a federal arrest." Strand put her hands out without being asked. Nora turned and walked toward the stairwell. Her shoulder was at maybe 10% now. The concrete stairs down to the ground level required a specific management of weight distribution, and she did it methodically, one step at a time, and when she came out onto the street, Lena Durst was there, sitting on the curb with a female agent crouched next to her, doing a basic welfare check, and Lena looked up when Nora came out. "She okay?" Nora asked the agent. "Physically, yes." Nora sat down on the curb next to Lena. Not gracefully. The shoulder dictated the angle of descent, and it was not elegant. She sat, and the cold concrete was real and solid and not nothing. Lena looked at her. "You told them, didn't you, about the wire?" "Yes." "She offered you a deal?" "Yes." Lena was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you take it?" Nora thought about how to answer that honestly, and the honest answer was not simple, which was usually the case with honest answers. "Because the deal required me to decide that the people on that indictment list mattered less than the convenience of not having to do something hard." She paused. "I've made that kind of trade before. I know what it costs." Lena looked at the street, at the ordinary mid-morning city moving around the extraordinary thing that was happening on this one block. "4 years, Lena said. "I've been carrying this for 4 years. "I know." "I saw 3 people get killed." She said it flat, without effect, the way you said things that had been said so many times internally that the emotional surface had worn smooth. "I didn't mean to see it. I was in the wrong place." She stopped. "And then I was in the wrong place for 4 years. Nora looked at her. "You hit a man with a blood pressure monitor this morning." Lena looked at her hands. Then something moved across her face that was unexpectedly close to a laugh. Not a happy one, but real. "I did." That was not the action of someone who needed protection. Nora paused. That was someone who was done being afraid. Lena was quiet for a moment. "I was still afraid." "I know. That's the part they don't tell you." Nora looked at the street. Afraid and effective are not mutually exclusive. Most people think you have to stop being scared before you can do anything. You don't. You do the thing scared. She paused. "You've been doing it for 4 years. The agent beside them stood and stepped away to give them a foot of space, which Nora appreciated. "What happens now?" Lena asked. "Grand jury in 2 weeks. You testify. 12 people get indicted, including a man named Gerald Park, who ran a regional medical network like a personal ATM for a trafficking operation, and his cousin Dennis, who managed the front end of it." She paused. "And a federal asset named Marcus Caldwell, who I used to trust, who fed them information for 8 months, will face a different kind of accounting in a different kind of room." Lena looked at her. "You knew him?" "Yes." "I'm sorry." "Don't be." Nora looked at the street. "He made his choices. I made mine. That's how it goes." She didn't say more than that because there wasn't more than that, or rather there was a great deal more, but it belonged to a different time and a different kind of quiet than this curb on Clement Avenue, with the city moving around them. The aftermath of the day took the shape that aftermaths always take. Long, administrative, conducted mostly in institutional spaces with bad lighting and too much coffee. Works team secured Vera Strand and processed the scene at the parking structure. Dennis Park was formally arrested on the third floor of Harlow Creek Medical Center at 11:42 in the morning, and the arrest happened in the administrative corridor outside the records department, which meant it was witnessed by 4 hospital staff members and 1 confused billing department temp who had been trying to find the bathroom and had very much not found it. Marcus Caldwell was taken into custody at 3:17 in the afternoon at a field office in Seattle, where he had reportedly arrived to debrief on the morning's events. The timing of that arrest was such that it happened while he was in a conference room with 2 other senior personnel, which meant it was also witnessed, and which meant that the particular kind of quiet that had protected his 8 months of cooperation with the network ended very publicly and in front of people who had trusted him. Nora was not there for either arrest. She was in the radiology suite at Harlow Creek Medical Center having her shoulder imaged, which revealed a grade 2 muscle tear and a bone bruise that the orthopedic attending, a compact, serious woman named Dr. Kwan, who had the manner of someone who'd seen a great deal of avoidable injury in her career, told her would require 4 to 6 weeks of rest and physical therapy. "You kept using it," Dr. Kwan said, looking at the image with the expression of a person reading a document they find both informative and frustrating. "I needed to. You did further damage by continuing to use it after the initial injury. I know. You should have immobilized it and stopped." "I know that too." Dr. Kwan looked at her. "But you didn't stop." "No." The doctor was quiet for a moment. "The initial injury. The mechanism?" "Collision in a confined space. I took a hit and continued the engagement." Dr. Kwan looked at her over the imaging screen with the expression of a woman adding information to a picture she was assembling. "What is your current position here?" "Nursing staff, 2nd floor." "How long?" 18 months. She nodded, wrote something in the chart, and told her to see the PT department for a referral. She didn't ask anything else, but as Nora was leaving, she said without looking up, "I heard what happened today, from Sandra Briggs." Nora stopped. "Sandra doesn't overstate things," Dr. Kwan said. "So when she told me what you did, I believed her." Nora didn't answer. There wasn't a clean answer to that. 4 to 6 weeks, Dr. Kwan said, and CPT. She was in the 2nd floor corridor at 4:30 in the afternoon, arm in a temporary sling the orthopedic team had provided, when she ran into Raymond Holt. He was coming out of room 211, Walter Osey, who had slept through almost everything and was now apparently asking about discharge timeline, with the cheerful tenacity of a man who felt fine and did not understand why the hospital was being slow about it. Holt came out into the corridor and stopped when he saw her. He looked at the sling, then he looked at her face. "Voss," he said, and stopped. He seemed to have a number of things in the vicinity of what he wanted to say, and to be having difficulty identifying which one came first. She waited. "I said something to you this morning," he said, "about the med cart, about moving faster." "You did." "That was—" He stopped again, tried again. "I've said a number of things to you over the last 18 months, about your pace, about your methods." He looked at his shoes for a second, which she recognized from the morning as something he did when he was trying to be honest in a way that didn't come easily to him. "I was wrong." She looked at him. He was a man in his early 50s who had been very good at his job for a long time, and somewhere in that long time had developed the habit of managing people by diminishing them just enough to keep them in a position where they didn't challenge him, and he'd done it to her for 18 months. And the doing had been so routine he probably hadn't even noticed it until something this morning had made the shape of it visible. "I know you were," she said. She said it without heat, without satisfaction either, just as a fact. "I also know you're telling me this now, which is more than most people would do." He looked at her. "We should have a conversation about your continued role here," he said. "Properly. Not in a hallway." He paused. "If you're willing." "I'm willing," she said. He nodded. He walked away toward the nurse's station, and she watched him go. And she thought about the specific weight of being told you were wrong by a person who found it genuinely difficult, and how it was different from being told you were right. Being told you were right felt like relief. Being told you were wrong by someone who found it hard felt like something else, something slower, something that required more from the person giving it than relief required from the person receiving it. It wasn't nothing. Sandra found her 10 minutes later at the end of the corridor, looking out the window at the parking lot below. "You're not supposed to be on your feet," Sandra said. "I know. The sling means rest, not stand in corridor." Sandra stopped next to her, looked out the window at the same nothing that Nora was looking at. Rourke's team finished their staff interviews. They're mostly gone. Good. She left something for you. Sandra held out an envelope. Sealed, standard hospital stationery. Nora's name written on the front in the kind of handwriting that was efficient and legible and did not waste space. She said you'd understand what it meant. Nora took it. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A letterhead she recognized. Not Rourke's federal team, but a different office, a different designation, one that she had not seen in 4 years, but that her brain indexed immediately and completely. And below the letterhead, a short paragraph, and below that a signature, and below that a handwritten line in Rourke's own script that said, "This came through my office this morning. I asked them to hold it until tonight." She read it twice. The formal language of a government document was what it was, dense and careful and precise to the point of difficulty. But what it said, stripped of the language, was this. Her operational record, classified and sealed for 4 years, had been reviewed and was being formally corrected. The sections that had attributed her separation to a mutual agreement, which was true, but incomplete in the way of true things that omit their most important context, were being amended to reflect the full circumstances, which was that her separation had followed a mission in which she had refused a direct order to eliminate a civilian and had documented that refusal, and had been told that her career was over for it, and had agreed to a mutual and quiet separation rather than face a formal process that would have cost everyone involved more than it was worth. The correction did not come with fanfare. It did not come with a ceremony. It came on a piece of paper in a hospital envelope on a corridor window ledge in Denton, Washington, at the end of the longest day she'd had in 4 years. She folded it. She put it in the pocket of her scrubs. Sandra was watching her. "Good news?" Sandra asked. "Old news," Nora said. "That finally got corrected." Sandra nodded. She understood that category of thing even without the specifics, because Sandra had worked in institutional environments for 22 years and understood how long it took for things that were true to become things that were recorded as true. "They're going to offer you something," Sandra said. "Rourke's office. Or someone above it. Probably. Will you take it?" Nora looked out the window. At the parking lot. At a delivery truck backing up to the loading dock. At a nurse walking across the lot toward the staff entrance, head down, moving with the specific tired but not done energy of someone in the middle of a shift. She thought about what Caldwell had said this morning. There are people here who want to bring you back in. She thought about what Rourke had said. I'd rather hear what's in it from you. She thought about Lena Durst on the curb, asking what happens now, and the answer being 2 weeks in a grand jury and 12 indictments, which was how things like this ended. Not in a moment, but in a process. Not in a building, but in rooms she'd never see. Carried by people doing the slow, unglamorous administrative work of making accountable what had been unaccountable. She thought about Mrs. Dunn in room 209, who needed her blood pressure checked, and Mr. Osei in 211, who wanted to go home, and Tomas at the nurse's station who had run concussion protocol on Pellerin and had then, she'd noticed, quietly made sure Pellerin had water and had not made a thing of it. She thought about the supply room she'd walked into at 7:13 that morning and the inventory she'd memorized before any of it started, because she couldn't walk into a room without doing that, and how that habit had saved 3 people's lives before 9 o'clock. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I'll think about it. Sandra nodded. Fair enough. She pushed off the window ledge and started back down the corridor. Her shoulder ached with the specific, persistent ache of something that was going to ache for a while, and her feet were tired in the way that feet got when they'd been going since 6:45, and it was now past 4, and she was hungry in a background, insistent way she'd been ignoring for hours. She was by almost any measure in bad shape. She was also the only person who had walked into and out of every moment of this day. Every confined room, every hallway, every calculation made under conditions that did not allow for uncertainty, and had made the choices she'd made, and was now walking back toward a nurse's station with her name badge hanging slightly crooked and her left arm in a sling and a piece of paper in her pocket that said, in formal government language, that she had been right. Not that she'd needed the paper to know it, but there was something specific about the knowing that existed only in you, for years, without any external record that agreed with it. The way you carried a true thing inside a world that had arranged its documentation around a different version, and the paper didn't change what had been true. It didn't restore the years or undo the quiet. It just meant that the record, finally, matched the reality. That was worth something. She let it be worth something. At the nurse's station, Tomas looked up from his chart. He looked at the sling, then at her face, with the expression she'd seen on him that morning, the one that was trying to recalibrate in real time. "The PT referral is in your patient portal," he said. "Dr. Kwan sent it through." "Thank you." "And Mrs. Dunn is asking about dinner." "I'll go check on her." He nodded. Then as she was passing, "Nora." She stopped. He looked like he had something he wanted to say and was taking one more second to find where it started. "I've been in this building for 2 years," he said. "I thought I knew most of what happened here." He paused. "I was wrong about a lot of things." She looked at him. He was 26 or 27, at the beginning of a long career, and the morning had shown him something about what people carried that wasn't visible from the outside, and he was still sitting with it. "Everybody is," she said. "The ones worth anything figure it out eventually." She went down the corridor to room 209 and knocked twice and pushed the door open. Patricia Dunn was sitting up in her bed, considerably more alert than she'd been that morning, and she had a dinner menu in her hand and a look of mild exasperation that suggested she'd been waiting longer than she considered reasonable. "The chicken or the fish?" she asked, without preamble. Nora sat down in the chair next to the bed and looked at the menu over her shoulder. "Fish," she said. "The chicken here is unreliable." Mrs. Dunn made a note on the menu. "You look terrible," she said, with the directness of a woman in her 60s who had survived surgery and did not see the point in soft pedaling. "I've had a long day." "I heard there was some kind of incident." Mrs. Dunn looked at the sling. "Were you involved?" "A little. More than a little, from what the nurse on the previous shift told me." Mrs. Dunn set the menu down and looked at her with the particular assessment of a woman who had spent 6 decades reading people. "You don't look like someone who does things halfway." Nora looked at her. "No," she said. "I don't." Mrs. Dunn nodded, as if that confirmed something she'd suspected. She picked the menu back up. "Well," she said, "I'm glad you were here." The words were simple and matter-of-fact and not dressed up in anything, which was exactly why they landed the way they did. Nora stayed in the chair a few more minutes, answering Mrs. Dunn's questions about the recovery timeline and the liquid diet, and when she might reasonably expect to sleep in her own bed again. And outside the window, the afternoon light was doing what afternoon light does in the Pacific Northwest in October, going gray at the edges, the kind of gray that was soft rather than bleak. The particular Northwest gray that people who grew up somewhere else sometimes found oppressive, and people who'd lived under it long enough found simply true. She had spent 4 years in this city trying to be invisible, trying to be the person that nobody looked at twice. She had chosen it deliberately, had built the life of it carefully, had become good at it in the specific way of someone who had been trained to become good at anything they set their intention toward. And the morning had taken all of that apart in the span of a few hours. Not violently, but inevitably, the way things that are true tend to eventually come through the surfaces built over them. She was not invisible. She had never been invisible. The people around her had simply not been paying enough attention. That was their limitation, not her camouflage. And she was done treating it as her camouflage. Whatever came next, the offer from Rourke's office, the conversation with Holt, the 4 to 6 weeks of PT, the grand jury in 2 weeks where 12 names would become 12 indictments, and Lena Durst would finally, after 4 years, say what she'd seen to people with the authority to act on it. Whatever came next was hers to navigate, and she would navigate it the way she navigated everything, with both eyes open, with the inventory of every room she walked into already memorized, with the particular combination of medical training and operational precision and 18 months of quiet mornings that had made her, without anyone noticing, exactly the person this day had needed. She had spent years believing that the choice was binary, The operator or the nurse? The woman who took lives or the woman who saved them? The person the Navy had built or the person she'd decided to become on a morning 4 years ago when she'd refused an order and walked away from the version of herself that followed orders she knew were wrong? But there was no binary. There had never been a binary. She was the woman who had memorized the inventory of a supply closet at 7 in the morning because she couldn't walk into a room without doing it. She was the woman who had double-checked every dosage, not because she lacked confidence, but because she understood, in her bones, what the difference between right and almost right looked like in a human body. She was the woman who had stood between a gunman and a frightened man in a hospital gown and said, "You should leave now," with the specific calm of someone who had already run every version of what happened next. She was both. She had always been both. And the world, as it turned out, needed both. Mrs. Dunn marked the fish on her dinner menu and told her to go home and get some rest, with the brisk authority of someone who had decided the nurse was now her responsibility rather than the other way around. And Nora smiled at that, a real one, small and unrehearsed, and said she would. She meant it. She walked out of room 209 and down the corridor of Harlow Creek Medical Center with the particular walk of a person who was tired and hurt and had a long road of PT appointments ahead of them and a set of decisions to make about what their life was going to look like now that the structure she'd built around the parts of herself she'd been trying to quiet had come apart in a single morning. She walked out of the building into the gray October afternoon. She stood on the pavement for a moment, just breathing. Then she thought about what came next, and instead of the old weight that came with that question, the old instinct to make herself smaller, to recede, to arrange herself into the background of whatever room she was in, she felt something else. Room. Like a door that had been closed for a long time, opened from the inside. The world had a way of teaching the same lesson in different rooms, in different cities, in different years, that the people it most needed were rarely the ones who announced themselves loudest. That strength spent years being invisible, not because it was weak, but because it was waiting for the moment that required it. That the most dangerous thing in any room was often the person that nobody had thought to watch. She had known that. She'd lived it. Now the world knew it too. She put her right hand in her pocket, felt the edge of the folded paper, and walked toward the staff lot where her 2009 Civic was parked in the far corner under the light that still hadn't been fixed. Some things you had to fix yourself. She'd add it to the list.